The sound that split the silence. Harlem had its own rhythm in those days, a living pulse that traveled through brownstone walls, jazz clubs, church pews, and crowded sidewalks. And in the center of that rhythm stood one man everyone knew by name, Bumpy Johnson. To some, he was feared, to others respected. To many in Harlem, he was simply the man who showed up when no one else would. But this story isn't about power the way headlines like to frame it. It's about a moment, a sound, and a choice that changed everything. The rain started before dusk, soft at first, then steady, tapping against umbrellas like impatient fingers. Bumpy stood outside a community gym on 125th Street, watching young boys shuffle in with worn gloves and borrowed shoes. Inside, a legend was expected to speak, Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber himself. For Harlem, Joe wasn't just a champion, he was proof that dignity could win under the brightest lights. Bumpy adjusted his coat collar. Beside him stood his longtime bodyguard, a quiet man named Marcus. Marcus rarely spoke unless necessary. His eyes scanned everything, rooftops, passing cars, shadows that lingered too long. "You think he'll come?" Marcus asked quietly. Bumpy gave a small smile. "Joe always shows up for his people." Inside the gym, folding chairs filled quickly. Mothers held babies, old men leaned on canes. Teenagers pretended not to care but sat in the front row anyway. Hope has a way of drawing a crowd. Then the door opened. Joe Louis stepped in without spectacle. No entourage, no flashing cameras, just a humble nod and that familiar, calm presence. Applause erupted, not loud and wild, but deep and grateful. Bumpy didn't step forward. He stayed near the back wall. He believed some moments belonged to the community, not to him. Joe spoke about discipline, about rising early, about how real strength wasn't in fists, but in restraint. You don't fight because you're angry, you fight because you have something worth protecting. Those words lingered. Outside, the rain grew heavier, streetlights flickered, and across the road, beneath an awning, a young man stood watching. His coat too thin for the weather, his jaw tight. He wasn't there for inspiration. Marcus noticed him first. The young man crossed the street slowly. His hands stayed inside his pocket. His steps were deliberate, not hurried. Marcus shifted his stance. Inside the gym, laughter broke out at one of Joe's stories. For a moment, Harlem felt safe. Then the door creaked open again. The young man entered. Rainwater dripped from his sleeves onto the wooden floor. His eyes didn't move toward Joe. They locked on Bumpy. There are seconds in life that stretch longer than minutes. Marcus saw the tension in the stranger's shoulders, saw the way his pocket sagged unnaturally, saw fear disguised as resolve. "Boss," Marcus whispered. The stranger pulled something from his coat. Gasps rippled through the back rows, and then a sharp sound split the air. Not the roar of chaos people expect in stories, just one sudden crack, a sound that bounced off gym walls and froze time itself. But it wasn't followed by screams, it wasn't followed by collapse, because Marcus had stepped forward at the exact instant the stranger moved, not to retaliate blindly, but to redirect the danger. In the scramble, the weapon clattered harmlessly against the floor, skidding beneath a folding chair. Silence swallowed the room. Children stared wide-eyed. Joe Louis stopped mid-sentence. Bumpy didn't flinch. Marcus stood between the threat and everyone else, breathing steady, hands firm but controlled. The young man trembled now, not with anger, but with the crushing realization of what he almost did. Bumpy stepped forward slowly. "No more sounds tonight," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, yet it carried weight. The young man's eyes filled, not with hatred anymore, but confusion, regret, hurt that had nowhere to go. "Why?" Bumpy asked, not accusing, just asking. The young man swallowed hard. They said you're the reason my father lost everything." Rumors have a way of turning pain into targets. Bumpy didn't respond immediately.
He looked around the gym, at the mothers clutching children, at Joe Louis watching with solemn understanding, at Marcus still standing firm but not violent. "You came here in front of kids," Bumpy finally said. "That's not strength." Joe stepped closer, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son," he said gently, "anger makes you loud. Courage makes you listen." The tension cracked, not from force, but from perspective. Police sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Someone had called them. The young man lowered his head before anyone else could force him to. Marcus relaxed only slightly, never careless. The gym slowly exhaled. Joe Louis turned back to the crowd. "This," he said carefully, "is why we build more than fists. We build futures." And the applause that followed wasn't for a fight avoided, it was for restraint. Outside, the rain softened again. Bumpy picked up an umbrella leaning by the door, simple, black, ordinary. He handed it to the trembling young man. "Walk home dry, and next time, come talk first." The police arrived moments later, but the story they expected wasn't the one they found. There was no retaliation, no chaos, just a community shaken, yet standing. The sound that night didn't change history because of violence. It changed history because of what didn't happen next. Because a bodyguard chose control over chaos. Because a champion chose words over fear. Because a man known for power chose restraint in front of children who were watching what true strength looked like. Harlem would talk about that night for years, not as the night someone pulled a trigger, but as the night a single sound reminded everyone that real power isn't in pulling one, it's in knowing when not to.
When silence became louder than fear. The weeks that followed did not carry the tension of that rainy night, but they carried something heavier and more enduring: reflection. Harlem had always been a neighborhood shaped by stories, and this one refused to fade, not because of spectacle, but because it revealed something rare, a different definition of power. People still spoke the name Bumpy Johnson with the layered understanding they had always held, but now there was an added dimension. They spoke of restraint as if it were a new currency circulating quietly through the streets. They spoke of that single sharp sound and the silence that followed as if it had drawn a line between two possible futures and forced everyone to choose. At the gym, attendance continued to grow. Boys who had once lingered outside with folded arms now laced up gloves with purpose. Fathers who had been skeptical began standing against the back wall, watching closely. Mothers brought younger siblings to sit in the bleachers. There was something about that place now that felt anchored. The building had not changed physically, yet it felt fortified by example rather than by force. The presence of Joe Louis had left more than inspiration. It had left a standard. His words about balance echoed in drills, in sparring sessions, in quiet moments between rounds when boys caught their breath and reconsidered their reactions. Marcus became a steady fixture in that environment. His role evolved from silent protector to deliberate mentor. He began teaching situational awareness classes in the evenings, not as combat training, but as emotional discipline. He explained how tension travels through posture, how anger narrows vision, how fear speeds the heartbeat until judgment becomes clouded. He never dramatized what had happened that night, but everyone knew the origin of his lessons. He emphasized that strength without control becomes recklessness, and recklessness often harms the very people one claims to defend. The young athletes listened because they had seen proof. They had watched a man step forward with precision rather than panic, and that image carried authority beyond words. Meanwhile, the young man who once walked into the gym with anger burning in his chest was undergoing his own transformation. After the job opportunity quietly arranged for his father began to stabilize their household, something shifted in him. Shame slowly gave way to accountability. He returned to the gym one afternoon, not as an intruder, but as a volunteer. At first, he stayed near the doorway, uncertain of his welcome, but Harlem has a way of recognizing sincere change. A few of the boys greeted him cautiously, then more openly.
He began sweeping floors after practice, organizing equipment, fixing broken laces. He did not try to erase what had happened, he tried to outgrow it. Bumpy observed these developments from a distance. He rarely inserted himself into daily operations, preferring the community to feel ownership of its progress, but he understood influence when he saw it. What had begun as a potentially destructive act had evolved into a ripple of responsibility. He met privately with Marcus one evening and acknowledged the bodyguard's expanding mentorship. Their conversation was understated, built on mutual respect rather than praise. Marcus admitted that he had once believed his duty ended with shielding one man. Now he understood it extended to shaping young ones who might otherwise mistake aggression for identity. The neighborhood press eventually revisited the story, though cautiously. Instead of sensational headlines, they focused on the gym's growing programs and the mentorship unfolding within its walls. Reporters described a community investing in itself. They wrote about increased enrollment in youth activities, about scholarships being discussed, about elders volunteering to tutor after training sessions. The narrative had pivoted away from confrontation and toward construction. That shift mattered more than attention. Joe Louis returned once again, this time unannounced, stepping into the gym quietly during a late afternoon session. When the boys noticed him, their energy surged, but he motioned for calm. He watched a sparring round unfold, nodding at footwork, correcting stances gently. Afterward, he gathered them in a circle and spoke not about victory, but about identity. He reminded them that the world often tries to define young men before they understand themselves. "Don't let someone else's fear write your story," he told them. The room held that sentence with reverence. It felt like an answer to the misunderstanding that had nearly turned into tragedy weeks before. The umbrella remained by the entrance, still available for anyone caught in sudden rain. Over time, it became less of a symbol of one incident and more of a quiet reminder of collective responsibility. Children who borrowed it returned it faithfully. It represented shelter that did not discriminate, protection that did not demand repayment. In subtle ways, it reshaped how people thought about strength. It suggested that covering someone from harm could be as powerful as confronting it. Harlem's rhythm continued, but there was a steadiness in it now. Conversations about dignity replaced whispers of retaliation. Young men debated discipline instead of dominance. The older generation took cautious pride in watching this recalibration. They understood how rare it was for a moment of potential violence to redirect into growth. They also understood how fragile that progress could be, so they guarded it collectively, reinforcing the idea that self-control was not weakness, but wisdom. Bumpy's presence in the neighborhood became less about reputation and more about responsibility. He attended fewer public gatherings, choosing instead to fund initiatives quietly and allow leaders like Joe and Marcus to guide the youth visibly. That decision surprised some observers who expected him to capitalize on renewed attention. But those who knew him understood that influence deepens when it steps back. He recognized that true change had to be owned by the community itself, not attributed to one figure. The sound that once cracked through the gym's walls was no longer replayed as a moment of fear. It was remembered as a fork in the road. People spoke of it in terms of what could have been lost and what was instead preserved. They acknowledged that history is not only shaped by dramatic events, but by restrained responses. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can speak louder than chaos. As autumn approached and the air turned crisp, the gym prepared for its first organized youth tournament. Posters were printed, volunteers assigned, equipment polished. The excitement carried a sense of earned pride. This was not merely a sporting event, it was a declaration that the neighborhood believed in constructive pathways. Joe Louis agreed to present medals. Marcus organized security discreetly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the effort invested. The young man who once brought tension to the doorway now coordinated refreshments with careful diligence, determined to contribute positively to the same space he had nearly disrupted. On the evening of the tournament, the building buzzed with anticipation. Parents filled the bleachers, children waved handmade signs, and the atmosphere felt celebratory rather than anxious. When Joe stepped to the center to address the crowd, he did not mention the past explicitly. Instead, he spoke about second chances, about communities choosing to build rather than break. His voice carried calm authority, and in the audience, Bumpy stood quietly among everyone else, blending into the applause. Harlem had not changed overnight, nor had its challenges disappeared, but something foundational had shifted. A single moment of restraint had opened a door for sustained growth. The bodyguard who moved with precision had inspired discipline. The champion who spoke gently had reinforced balance. And the man often defined by power had demonstrated that influence can be measured by what one prevents, not what one provokes. The silence that followed that sharp sound weeks earlier had been empty. It had been full of possibility. And from that possibility, a different future was being patiently constructed, one disciplined breath, one careful choice, and one borrowed umbrella at a time.